Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Malek, and this is our webinar for the month of March. Knack Training offers a free webinar once a month about a topic to be determined by public demand. Today's topic is about Microsoft PowerPoint, but really it's about any type of presentation software, or even presentations that you don't give with software. It's about something called visual thinking. Visual thinking is a term that a gentleman named Dan Rohn uses a lot in his material, and we'll be talking about his books here in a little bit. And the basic idea behind today's session is to get you comfortable with choosing the appropriate diagrams, charts, illustrations, and photographs for presentations that you give. For those of you who have never met me before, my name is Neil Malek. You can email me, neil@knacktraining.com, anytime after today's session in order to follow up and ask further questions. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and the principal over at Knack Training. In today's session, you will be muted. You can use the mic button up at the top of the screen in order to ask me questions, or on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you have a chat box, and you can use that chat box to ask me questions as well. You're currently in Q&A mode, so you can go ahead and speak to the people in your office if you need to, because we will not be able to hear you until you unmute your line. After today's session is over, you'll be able to find a recording of this on youtube.com/neilmalek, as well as the recording of previous webinars about the same family of topics and other concepts that I like to throw together videos for. There's a ton of stuff out there, so please feel free to peruse my YouTube channel. Thanks, Rosemary. Peruse my YouTube channel, find things about Outlook, about Excel, about Photoshop. Pretty much everything under the sun is available to you on youtube.com/neilmalek. Today's session has a handout that helps you to walk through the same basic concepts. If you go to knacktraining.com/handouts.aspx, you'll find the handouts for the previous two webinars, the one about being able to analyze your audience, the one about being able to create a theme and a structure for your presentation, and now this third session about visual thinking in presentations. So feel free to download those handouts at any time. Those are free and clear on the internet, available to anybody who has the opportunity to download. So again, this session is one of multiple that's about being able to build a great presentation. And while many of my students use PowerPoint for this, Keynote or Prezi could just as easily be used for the same basic concepts. When we try to build great presentations, there's three basic elements that are at play. You need to be able to build a great message. Being able to build a great message sort of hinges around your ideas of analyzing your audience, building a theme for the presentation, and being able to present the ideas that you have in a visual context. So the previous two webinars were about analyzing your audience and building a theme, and this one is about visual thinking, about finding ways of communicating information visually instead of doing it through text. Immediately after this, you'll find in May, June, and July that we're going to do a series of webinars about being able to build the perfect diagram, design your slide, and work with motion in your presentation to communicate information as well as possible. This is something I call visual design. And then finally, of course, we have the delivery. Can you deliver your topic in as dynamic a way as possible, and therefore deliver what you spent so much time and effort in constructing? Alright, so let's get off the ground with visual thinking here. The biggest problem that people have in PowerPoint is they open PowerPoint, they immediately see a slide that says click to add text, and they start to type in those bullet points. And at this point, I hope that not many people need to have it reinforced that adding bullet points is a bad idea. But let's just sort of briefly describe why this is. When we add text to the screen in PowerPoint, what we're doing is we're adding more text for the brain to process. And so no matter what you say or write, those pieces of information are processed generally by the same part of the brain. by those language centers of the brain. What we want to do is not only tap into the language center of the brain, but also into the visual center of the brain. Because the visual center of the brain allows you to take a concept and more thoroughly explore it by looking at a diagram, by looking at a photograph, and then pulling insight from that diagram, from that chart, from that photograph, from that illustration. By continually hitting the exact same part with specifically written text or specifically spoken text, we have this sort of restriction where we're always going to be addressing it in the same way. By hitting the visual centers of the brain, we give ourselves many more opportunities for translating the information into different combinations, to processing it in different ways, and coming up with various different insights. So we want to try to use visual thinking in our presentations, but of course we need to find some way of accomplishing this. So the four major ways: photographs, illustrations, or some sort of icon, if you will, being able to take numbers and represent them in chart form, and being able to represent concepts in diagram form. So a lot of people buy into this, the idea that you want to add a visual component to what your slides have. But a big thing that I find is that most people only ever do one thing, and that is, let's say they're talking about money, for example. The image that they bring in for money is always describing what money we have. If they're talking about a person, they always show an image that describes the person that we're talking about. And so in that way, what we're actually doing in many respects is we're always answering the who part of the presentation. But many presentations are not really about who or what we're talking about, but why we're talking about it or how we're talking about it. So the easiest possible way to translate your ideas into images is to actually sit down and ask yourself the dumb questions that we teach, sixth graders when they're learning to write newspaper articles, right? You always need to answer who, what, when, where, why, and how. And the problem is that a lot of us get away from that. We get away from that idea of we have to be able to answer those questions. We have to be able to translate the answers to those questions into visuals. So a lot of people, again, will take the focus to what it is that we are talking about. So we'll see a picture of a person or something along those lines. And that's perfectly valid, but oftentimes we need to answer the other questions. So let's do a quick run through here of the types of questions that you need to ask and the types of illustrations to those that we can use in a visual context. So who and what in presentations are typically the same question, because sometimes we're talking about a person, sometimes we're talking about a corporation, sometimes we're talking about a team, sometimes we're talking about an organization, and sometimes we're talking about an actual physical object or a concept. So that would always, all of those are basically the same. We're addressing what it is that we're talking about, whether that what is a human being, whether it's a theoretical human being, whether it's a set of human beings, or whether it's an organization, a corporation, a computer, what have you. So when we decide to address the who and what questions, what we're doing is we're building a portrait of the person or the thing or the entity, and we need to find ways of interestingly presenting that portrait. A lot of times it's a picture of the person in question. So Willie Mays, for example, you can't find a much better picture of Willie Mays than celebrating a championship. But sometimes we're talking about a more theoretical human being, and so a silhouette of a person that allows you to focus on the attributes of that hypothetical person rather than the actual essence of the person himself. That can often be another way of building a different idea of your portrait. A lot of times we'll get focused on whether it's Willie Mays or it's somebody else and the information that we have specifically about Willie, and we won't focus so much on the ideas behind that person. On the flip side, If we focus on the attributes around that person, then this could be any person that fits that cookie cutter mold. So here we have a photograph and here we have an illustration, both allowing us to give a portrait of a person, but allowing us to focus on different elements of that person. If you're talking about a real person inside your organization, it's always the best idea to take a real physical picture of that person. But if you're thinking about your customers, as we talked about in the audience profiling earlier, you'll find that it's easier to find a silhouette of a person that represents that audience member and then be able to communicate to that person's attributes. Now, if we decide that it's an organization, the description of that organization can often be the individual people and the relationships that those people have. And it can often be something like a segmented description of that organization. If this pie chart explains where our revenues come from, then that describes our organization very thoroughly. And it's oftentimes important for us to pinpoint elements within the organization, and so it's easy to pinpoint slices of the pie that are relevant to us. And of course, if it's an object, if it's a computer, if it's a process, we can describe that what as well through a photograph or through a diagram. But we often want to get away from the who and what questions. Like I said earlier, we're talking there in who and what about just the portrait of that individual, just the portrait of that corporation, and that's as far as most people go. We want to also assess whether we're answering questions about when, where, how, and why. How's everybody doing so far? Anybody have any questions? So if we're talking about where, there's an obvious where, right? We're talking where you probably want to draw a map, right? There's my house. If you're talking about where, though, a lot of times you're talking about where you are in relation to other things. So you might describe it as part of a diagram. For example, here, you might say, where is our team within this organization? You might say, well, there's a central administrative unit, and there are 4 subunits that are satellites around that administrative unit, and we are one of the 4 satellites. That helps give context to where your team is in relation to the other teams, what their influence is, and what their relationship to the central element happens to be. It's still a where question, it's just a different kind of where question. In the same way, we have the where in terms of how things overlap. And so if we're talking about what segment of the audience our product needs to target, we're talking about a where type of question. We're targeting where this type of person interacts with or overlaps with this other type of person. So often Venn diagrams can be a where answer. And it can also be answered by a scatter chart. Now, if you use a bubble chart here, it allows you to say that we're one element out of a bunch, and you can see where we are in relation to our competitors, because our competitors are different sizes, they're in different spots on the chart, and you can see where we're better than some of our competitors, where we're worse than some of our competitors, and what we can do to move from one place to another. So we don't want to focus just on, thank you very much, Peggy. We don't want to focus just on the map version of where. We want to think about where in a much more hypothetical way. Where are we in the greater scheme of things? Where do we fit in all of the products that are out there? Where do we fit out of all the organizations that we're a part of? We can also talk about when. Now, obviously, when can be answered by a calendar, but when can also be answered by a timeline of some kind. Now, as you can see, you can have a very simple timeline, an illustration of the when we are. If we're talking about the training component that I'm interested in, I know that I come after the build of the product and before the implementation of the product, so that people can be trained before they have to implement that thing. or when can be a much more intricate timeline. But ultimately, when is always about time passing, and that time passing can be addressed with a calendar or a timeline. So those are relatively easy to understand, and you're pretty much not going to have pictures or illustrations for something like that. You're almost always going to have a diagram that allows people to see where they are in time. Now, when it gets interesting is in the how. How is almost always in flowchart form. So what we're talking about in how is, okay, you're trying to describe some idea to me in a presentation, and I get the idea, but I have no idea how you intend on us implementing this. So it's very important for me to see the big picture. It's very important for me to see how one element feeds into the next, into the next, into the next. So far we've got who and what. Who and what is a portrait of the concept, a portrait of the idea, a portrait of the person, a portrait of the corporation, a portrait of the organization. That portrait can be portrayed in photographic form, in illustrations, or in diagrams. Where is both a map and it's a diagram. And when is a calendar or it's a timeline. How is pretty much always one thing. It's a diagram that allows us to see the flow of the process. Why? So we've got who, what, when, where, and how, but we don't have why. So why is the nice thing that let's see, how do I explain this? Why is where we go back to the originals and we say, okay, you know how we drew the portrait of this product, the portrait of this corporation, the portrait of this person? Now let's talk about where that person can go, where that corporation can go, what that product can do. So whereas in the previous examples, in the who and what, and the when, the where, and the how, we always described a status quo. We always described a thing as it is. In why, we describe how something changes. So we take that initial bubble chart, we take that initial thing that describes where we are in space, and we say, if we go ahead with this process that I've proposed to you, then we can take that bubble that represents us, and we can move, and we can grow. And this right here is why. You're explaining to your team members, to your audience, why it is that the thing that you are proposing needs to happen. And so in contextual terms, being able to take a chart and represent this is a very strong way of doing it. And of course, the other strong way of doing this is tapping into emotion. So we're coming back from all of those charts and diagrams, and we're presenting to you images again, because images are those things that tug at your heartstrings. This right here shows you why financially you should do something. But this shows you why on an emotional level, on a conceptual level, on a human level, you should do whatever it is that you're doing. So if there's any emotion whatsoever to your presentation, if there's any call to action that represents an idea that your audience will really swell behind, then photographs are a wonderful way of translating the why. If it's all about money, well then you've got your charts. And it's important for you to highlight the part of the chart that represents us, that represents the thing that we're most concerned with, and then demonstrate what the change is in that particular chart. So we've got who, what, when, where, why, and how. And now we go one step deeper. We're going to go ahead and take the illustrations, take the photographs, take the charts and the diagrams, and we're going to ask very simple questions of those elements. Questions that not enough people ask, again. So if you say to yourself, well, of course, I'm already using a chart, I'm already using a diagram to represent some idea. Then the next thing that you need to do is actually in the handout. It's the next page in the handout. After answering the 5 questions, we've got the idea of is this going to be a simple representation or an elaborate presentation of the information? And this is an important question because if you are presenting to a group of people, um, the the dominant idea I always have in the back of my head is the old quote that says, everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And what that means is that you should never force your audience to really think about things, to really process through things and come up with complicated um, ideas on their own. You should be able to present this to them in a way that makes it easy for them to get to the point where they need to get to. So we almost always default towards a more simple representation of the information. But the other side of that is if you're too simple with your information, then people who have a lot of information already are going to be bored by it and possibly insulted by dumbing down the concept. So it's important for you to be able to say, on the left, we have a timeline that's simple so that people at the highest echelons who just need to understand the big picture know where we are, what phase we're in. We're in the middle phase of a particular presentation. Or people who don't have a lot of information about the concept in the first place, again, have a simple representation of that. Whereas the people who have a lot of information, who feel like they fully understand the concept, they need the detail. They need each of the individual elements on the timeline. Or, again here, if we're talking about the betterment of society because of some product that we have or some concept that we're presenting, then for many people, the picture on the left, the simple version of the information, is going to be more than enough. In fact, it's going to resonate with them. It's going to pull them along. But there are a lot of people who are going to be responsible for actually implementing this. And so showing them the faces of 2 smiling kids is almost condescending to those folks. You want to make sure that they understand that what this is going to do has real tangible results. It has a real tangible thing that you put your hands around and say, this is the increase in this factor. Right? If you're presenting this idea that says raising the minimum wage is going to improve things, showing a picture of 2 kids may make everybody feel good about themselves, but it's important that you actually back up how raising the minimum wage is actually going to improve their lives, not just showing them smile. So it's important to show the change in the chart rather than just showing the simple version of things. Another thing you need to ask yourself is, am I responsible here for showing the comparison between 2 elements, or is it better to show just a single individual by itself? Again, this goes back to the simplicity idea, right? The simplest possible concept would be to show the individual on the slide, and that would be it. But oftentimes, the easiest way to explain something is to compare and contrast it with something else. So you need to ask yourself whether you're doing a portrait in terms of the properties of that single thing, or whether you're doing the portrait as a contrast with the competitors or the other elements in the same space. And both of these are answered by the previous exercises that we did on audience profiling. If you understand your audience, you understand whether you should tilt more towards the simple side of the equation or more towards the elaborate side of the equation. If you understand your audience, you know whether they need a comparison or whether it's more appropriate to show them the simplest possible version of things, the simplest possible portrait. And in the same way, you need to analyze the situation and your audience and figure out whether it's important to represent the actual stable version of things or the change that we see in things. So again, this is the representation of the bubble chart as a static element or representing the change that our organization is going through. And by figuring out which of the major questions this answers, who, what, when, where, why, and how, and then asking yourself the further isolating questions of, is this simple or elaborate? Is this individual or is it comparison? And is it stable or is it change? You can identify the appropriate ways to represent the information to give people the stuff that they need and not any of the noise that they don't need. Does anybody have any questions about that stuff? Anything I can address for you? So where does this take us? First of all, the next presentation I'm going to be doing is in May about diagram design. So we'll go back to the idea of diagrams, picking out diagrams and specifically designing those diagrams for different situations. You can always register for that on knacktraining.com. But what can you do today? Right, so today you've got the handout. So you can download the PDF handout that allows us to describe, is this simple or is it elaborate, etc., etc. So please do download that handout and walk through it a couple of times, get yourself comfortable with those ideas. But then the most important things that you can do are you can break out the books that I use every day when I'm building presentations and really when I'm explaining anything. There's a guy named Dan Rome who has this concept at the back of a napkin, right? That every idea that you want to communicate to anybody should be able to be drawn very simply on the back of a napkin. And if you can do that, then you can explain any concept to anyone. And the beauty of these books is it breaks down this idea of how do you analyze your thoughts, and then how do you translate those into some sort of visual. And whether you're a visual person or not, they really help to get you to that point of picking out the right pictures, of picking out the right diagrams, things like that. He's got this great codex in the book that you'll want to have. So please do go out and find The Back of a Napkin by Dan Rome. He also has Unfolding the Napkin, which is a workshop book that goes right along with it. It's fantastic material. What else do we have? So anytime that you want to use images in your presentations, you want to be able to find great ones. So all of the illustrations, all of the diagrams, all of the pictures that I used in today's session were either from the Stock Exchange, which is a free open source photography website, from Google's hosted light images, or from Getty Images. Getty Images is what I use when I actually need to spend money on pictures, and the Stock Exchange is what I use when I don't need to spend money on pictures. The Life magazine pictures are where I go to get my historical photographs. So anything that you see from me that's in black and white, like the Willie Mays picture, for example, those come from the Google website for Life magazine. And then the Noun project allows you to download illustrations, icons that represent things, which is great for things like concepts that you want to be able to present to people in a very consistent way. So let me go ahead and show you guys those. So we have, first of all, the Stock Exchange, where you can see if I search for something like robot, there are these great pictures of wind-up robots and things like that. You have Getty Images, where you can do the exact same thing and purchase those images. And then here we have Life magazine. So Life magazine has been around since the dawn of time, essentially, and you can see that they've got these really great historical photographs of this robot that's helping a woman zip up her dress. These historical photographs you can download. You can use in presentations of a variety of different kinds. And then finally, if you go to the Noun project, you can see these very simple illustrations of the concept. So here again, I searched for robot. And the nice thing about using these illustrations is that they are consistent, right? If you pick this image of a robot right here, and then you go back and you do a search for flower, for example, then you'll find all of these different flower illustrations from the Noun project that you can use. Whereas if you went to Getty Images, you might get this image of a robot, and then if you search for flower, you'd have a difficult time finding a flower image that necessarily matched up perfectly. So the nice thing about those illustrations is their consistency. Now finally, besides being able to find the right images, you want to be able to pick out the right chart for the specific instance, right? So If you go to the two links that are in the handout or that are on my screen right now, there are chart pickers from Dr. Abella and also from the Berkeley School of Journalism. And they're beautiful PDFs here. So this is from the Berkeley School of Journalism. And basically this helps new journalists figure out whether they should use pie charts or column charts or things like that. And so you can look here and you can see something like, okay, well, if I have a large data set, it's better for me to use one of these options. If I have a small data set, it's better for me to use one of these options. If I have the subset showing a percentile, it's better for me to use one of these possibilities, etc. And then as I scroll down, it has a description, a brief description that says, okay, a pie chart. If you use a pie chart, you're going to use percentages in here. That's great. But if you need to rank your data, you need to use something else. So it's a great document for helping point you in the right direction. In the same way, Dr. Abella has this fantastic chart picker. So it asks you the question, first of all, what are you trying to do? And if you're trying to compare information, then you have to ask yourself, okay, what exactly are you trying to compare? Maybe I'm trying to compare cyclical data. Maybe I'm trying to compare many categories at the same time. Maybe I'm trying to show a distribution. And so it can help you pick out exactly the type of chart for the scenario in question.